invasion of Ukraine.
I just listened to the biggest pile of bull. Have a listen to this.
Look at the conflict in Ukraine. One side is dominating the global narrative. The other side has been proclaimed the villain.
It's funny how she's kept that picture of the US president on there as if it's just him. But if we look over to the UN when Russia came on to justify its invasion of Ukraine, most of the delegation walked out.
UN has to take a very strong stance in defense of its own principles.
I'm talking about NATO and Russia. But what led the world to the point of this invasion? Leaders in Moscow say they are the aggrieved party. They are the victims of NATO's eastward march, and they're only acting in self-defense.
This is literally straight out of a textbook psychological analysis of a narcissist. They do the attacking, but they make themselves out to be the victim.
Here's why. Over the past 25 years, NATO has been creeping closer to the Russian border. Former Soviet states have become NATO members. This military alliance has technically absorbed the entire security belt of Moscow.
Within that statement, there's an element of just completely forgetting the Cold War. And the fact that Russia was also expanding during that period, such as Hungary, and attempting to take over in Italy. So, no sovereignty, no self-determination. Russia dictates what goes on inside those countries and who they ally with. That's what she's just said.
Russia sees this expansion as a provocation. It hurts their security interests and won't end well for both sides, they said. The warnings were clear. NATO ignored them. Call it their myopia or arrogance, they downplayed Moscow's concerns, kept proceeding with new rounds of expansion until things blew up in Ukraine.
We also have to include Syria and all the atrocities caused there, but also they'd already invaded Ukraine and taken over Crimea, which she has totally ignored. So that's at least 4 states that Russia's been involved in attacking. But of course they're the victims.
Did NATO push Ukraine into this war? NATO cannot escape the blame for what's unfolding in Ukraine. In 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated and the Iron Curtain was completely demolished. Europe's regional order hinged on one question: should Germany align itself with the US and NATO, or should it join the Russians through the Warsaw Pact? The US government, under George H.W. Bush, made an offer to Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev. It suggested if Germany became a NATO member, NATO would stop expanding, not 1 inch eastwards. No new members. Today, the US says it made no such promise, that no such deal was ever struck, but hundreds of memos, meeting minutes, and transcripts from US archives indicate otherwise. Nevertheless, Moscow bought the offer. It demolished the Warsaw Pact in the hope that the West would follow suit.
The presenter seems to have conflated several things, and it doesn't make any sense. The Warsaw Pact, those Warsaw countries that you just saw, well, they were ruled under dictators, and those dictators were ruled by Russia. That is not quite the same as the NATO Pact, which you could go into or you could leave.
That NATO too would be dissolved, but that never happened. NATO refused to cease operations. And to add insult to injury, they kept the door for membership open. Russia saw it as a stab in the back.
NATO kept itself open. Maybe the US still saw it as a useful tool. So did all the democratic countries inside of NATO saw it as a useful tool. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. But it's interesting that she's used that stab in the back claim. That claim is what was used to build up Hitler going into power. He kept claiming, and so did the extreme right, that the Germans were stabbed in the back in World War I. And they claimed different groups had done it. That's for another video. But it's interesting that she's using similar far-right Nazi rhetoric to describe this.
And NATO kept pushing the dagger deeper. Look at the situation in Russia's backyard. It does not end there. As of 2021, NATO officially recognized 3 more aspiring members: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. Last we checked, NATO was also in talks with Sweden, Finland, and Serbia for membership.
So she's complaining that democratic countries that consider themselves under threat from Russia want to join this bloc so they're not invaded like Ukraine. That's what she's complaining about. That democratically elected governments want to join this group in order to protect themselves from an aggressor.
So to put it simply, much of Eastern Europe, which once used to be part of the Soviet Union, has now joined NATO, and this happened despite Russia's protests and warnings. The last reasonably friendly warning from Moscow came in the year 2007. Vladimir Putin addressed the annual Munich conference. where he said, and I'm quoting, "NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders. This expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask against whom is this expansion intended and what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact."
Now, it's interesting how much she's sided with Putin here. You could argue, yes, it is aggressive. Maybe they should have asked Russia to join into NATO and become one big pact. The unfortunate thing is, and it was interesting that stab in the back claim was made earlier, because Putin has dismantled democracy within Russia. Legitimately brought in, elected, there's some disputes over the election results and how much he tainted them. But on top of all of that, he has broken down the system and rigged it in such a way that it is almost near impossible to be able to get democratically elected into the Russian government.
If it wasn't for President Putin, Russia as a state would be struggling through the toughest times now and possibly may have ceased to exist. Only Putin has saved the state from total collapse.
And in return, Cossacks do what they feel saves Putin. During the 2014 Olympics, the band Pussy Riot performed a song that disparages Putin. Cossacks unleashed their centuries-old tradition of vigilante violence. Last year, Cossacks doused the main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, and attacked his staff. And in Kaliningrad, when a small group of demonstrators demanded the government change its foreign policy, a Cossack beat up 63-year-old protester Yevgeny Grishin. He lost 80% of his eyesight.
If the regime can't suppress civil protests through legal means, they punish the people through affiliated associations, like the Cossacks. The regime acts through them.
You have to be one of Putin's cronies. That is exactly what Hitler did. He got elected democratically and then dismantled the system internally. But on top of that, one thing that really irks me with this presenter is that she's not mentioned that Russia, on 2 occasions, dumped chemical and nuclear material over the south of England in order to kill Russians, and has said nothing about that. In fact, she seems to come off and present Putin as the person who is someone you should listen to.
They say there are 2 sides to every story. Consider both before you form an opinion.
Absolutely. As a historian, you should always look at both sides of an argument. But unfortunately, this level of bias is ridiculous, and it makes me wonder what on earth is taking place in India and what Modi and Putin are doing behind closed doors. The disturbing thing about all of this, we're starting to see some of this rhetoric also come through in the English media.
And this endless, relentless march to the east of the European Union and implicit that not far behind was NATO, led to me giving a speech in 2014 in the European Parliament where I said, our actions will give Mr. Putin a casus belli, and I said there will be a war in Ukraine.
I have to say, it's quite disturbing. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to support me through Patreon or buying me a coffee. Otherwise, for free, you just have to click that like button, share, and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.